It was an unusual Christmas night, with snow covering every corner of the small town. Inside a cozy house, two cats, Felix and Luna, were nestled by the fireplace. Their half-closed eyes observed the shining Christmas tree, but the atmosphere was far from festive. Outside, the wind howled, and on the porch, something unexpected was happening. A skinny dog, covered in snow and shivering with cold, placed a paw on the glass door. He looked inside with eyes overflowing with plea and loneliness. Inside, the cats raised their heads simultaneously, their ears alert. Felix growled softly, while Luna shrank back in fear. The door creaked open as Clara, the owner of the house, noticed the animal's presence. "Oh my, what are you doing here, poor thing?" she said, carefully picking up the dog. He was a small stray, with scruffy fur and injured paws. Clara knew he wouldn't survive the night if left outside. But as she brought him in, the cat's reaction was immediate. Felix hissed, arching his back, and Luna darted under the sofa. "Don't worry, he's only staying for the night," Clara said, trying to calm the felines. Little did she know, that night would change their lives forever. Clara had lived alone since moving to that countryside home. Felix and Luna were her constant companions, and she treated them like her children. The two cats had distinct personalities. Felix was the protector, always on guard and territorial, while Luna was sweet but frightened by any change. The dog, whom Clara named Fred, was the opposite. He seemed grateful for any gesture of affection, keeping his tail low, as if apologizing for his existence. As soon as he entered the house, he lay on the rug, far from the cats, who eyed him with distrust. Clara tended to Fred's injuries and offered him some food. The crunching sound of kibble seemed to irritate Felix, who meowed loudly as if protesting. Luna, on the other hand, simply watched from a distance, her wide eyes full of curiosity. That night, Fred tried to approach the cats but was met with hisses and swats. He backed off after each attempt, his eyes full of sadness. To Clara, it was clear that cohabiting would be a challenge. The next day, she noticed that Felix and Luna avoided even entering the same room as Fred. But something started to change when Clara brought out a box of Christmas decorations from the cupboard. While setting up the tree, she noticed Fred was fascinated by the lights, while the cats, curious, cautiously moved closer to him. The days leading up to Christmas seemed increasingly tense in the house. Fred, the dog who had already faced so much abandonment, was determined to win the cats' trust. However, Felix and Luna were not making it easy. Whenever he got close, Felix hissed and raised a paw in a threatening gesture, while Luna would run and hide under the sofa. On the third night after Fred's arrival, Clara decided to leave the animals together in the living room to encourage them to get used to each other. She sat on the sofa, petting Luna while Fred watched from a distance, lying in his corner. In a moment of courage, Fred slowly stood up and began walking towards the cats. His steps were cautious, and his eyes revealed a mixture of hope and fear. However, before he could get closer, Felix jumped in front of him, letting out a loud meow that echoed through the room. Fred stopped immediately, ears down, as Felix stared at him with fixed, defiant eyes. Clara quickly intervened, picking Felix up in her arms and trying to calm him. "Felix, he just wants to be your friend. Why don't you give him a chance?" That night, Fred seemed more withdrawn than ever. He didn't try to approach again and spent hours staring out the window, watching the snow fall outside. It seemed as though he was questioning if he had made a mistake in daring to dream of having a home. The next morning, Clara decided to go out to get more supplies for Christmas, leaving the three animals alone. When she returned, she found clear signs of conflict. The Christmas tree decorations were scattered on the floor, and a small scratch on Fred's nose suggested that Felix had attacked him. Luna was hiding in a corner, frightened by the commotion. Clara sighed deeply, picked Fred up in her arms, and looked into his eyes. "You did nothing wrong, boy. It's hard for them, but they'll learn, I promise." That night, Clara tried a different approach. She placed all the animals around the Christmas tree and began hanging new ornaments, hoping that a calm activity could create a more harmonious environment. Luna, always curious, approached to play with the shiny ornaments, while Felix, as expected, stayed close to her, always keeping an eye on Fred. Fred, on the other hand, remained still, watching the feline siblings from a distance. At one point, one of the ornaments fell to the floor and rolled towards Fred. He looked at Clara, as if asking for permission, and then carefully gave the ornament a gentle nudge with his nose, sending it back in the cat's direction. Intrigued, Luna approached and nudged the ornament back, initiating a sort of game. Felix, however, was unimpressed. He walked halfway towards them and positioned himself between Fred and Luna, stopping the game. The tension between the two males was evident. Fred backed off once again, as if recognizing Felix's dominance and accepting that he still wasn't welcome. But Clara, who observed everything, noticed something important. Luna was beginning to let her guard down. Even though she was still nervous, there was something about Fred that piqued her curiosity. Clara saw this as a sign and decided to try one last strategy. On Christmas Eve, Clara prepared a special feast for the animals. She placed 3 bowls with pieces of roasted turkey, one for each. Felix and Luna always ate side by side, but Fred, sensing Felix's hostility, waited in the corner, not daring to approach. When Clara placed Fred's bowl next to the cat's bowls, the inevitable happened. Felix, territorial and protective, glared at Fred with his fur bristling. The dog hesitated, but his hunger was too great. When he took a step towards the bowl, Felix lunged with a fierce meow, slapping the floor as a warning. Fred took 2 steps back, leaving the food for Felix, and sat on the floor, head lowered and eyes filled with sadness. That was Clara's breaking point. She knelt on the floor between the two and, with a firm tone, said, "Felix, that's enough. Fred is part of our family now, and you need to accept that." Luna, who had stayed away until then, surprised Clara by slowly walking over to Fred. She stopped in front of him and, with a gentle touch of her paw on the dog's nose, seemed to acknowledge that he wasn't a threat. Felix watched the scene closely, and for a moment, Clara thought he might intervene again. But instead, something unexpected happened. Felix lowered his ears, took 2 steps towards Fred, and sat next to Luna. He still seemed wary, but for the first time, he didn't react aggressively to the dog's presence. For Clara, that small gesture was all she needed. The tension seemed to start dissipating, and the atmosphere began to shift. On Christmas morning, Clara was awakened by an unusual sound, a soft purring mixed with a long sigh, almost like a groan of contentment. Intrigued, she went downstairs and stopped at the entrance of the living room, stunned by the scene she found. Luna, the shyest and most distrustful, was lying close to Fred. Her small body was almost touching the dog's, and she seemed relaxed, something rare for her. Fred was motionless, almost as if he didn't want to disrupt the moment, but his eyes sparkled with happiness. He looked at Clara as if to say, "Did I do it?" Before Clara could react, she heard the unmistakable sound of Felix jumping down from the Christmas tree. Felix descended slowly and walked to the center of the room, where he stopped and stared at Fred. The dog, noticing the movement, lifted his head and stayed completely still, as if bracing for another attack. Felix stopped just a few inches from Fred, and the silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Clara held her breath, fearing that the progress made with Luna would be undone. But then, something unexpected happened. Felix tilted his head slightly to the side. His gaze was no longer one of distrust but of curiosity. He stepped closer to Fred, lowered his ears, and with a slow movement, rubbed his head against the dog's muzzle. Clara could hardly believe what she was seeing. Fred, hesitant, wagged his tail lightly, as if asking whether this was real. Felix let out a soft meow, not of threat but of acceptance. Luna, watching the scene, stood up and walked over to the two, joining the moment. For the first time, they were all together. Clara felt tears welling up as she watched the scene. It was as if all the weight of the previous weeks disappeared in an instant. Fred was finally part of the family, and the 2 cats, once so resistant, had learned to accept him. Later, as Clara prepared breakfast, she heard playful sounds coming from the living room. Peeking through the door, she saw Fred running in circles around the Christmas tree after Luna, while Felix observed from above, occasionally joining in by knocking an ornament down for Fred to chase. That moment was a true Christmas miracle. 3 such different souls finding, somehow, a perfect balance. In that instant, Clara knew her family was finally complete. Clara was feeling a joy she hadn't experienced in a long time. She realized that the moment called for celebrating what could only be described as a small miracle. As she set the table, the house felt different. There was no longer the constant tension between the animals. On the contrary, everything seemed peaceful, as if the home had finally found its true harmony. Fred now walked through the house with more confidence, though he still showed respect for the cats. Felix, who had been the most resistant, seemed to have fully accepted the new family member. Not only did he allow Fred to come closer, but he had also started following the dog around the house, observing his actions, almost like an older brother finally acknowledging the youngest. As Clara placed the plates on the floor, Luna, always the more playful one, tried to tug at the tip of Fred's ear with her tiny paws. The dog, instead of backing away, wagged his tail and even let out a soft bark of joy. Felix watched closely, sitting next to them, and after a moment, decided to join the fun, nudging Fred with his head. It was such a simple moment, but Clara knew it represented something much greater, the unity of this unconventional family. As the three of them ate together for the first time, Clara took a picture to capture the moment forever. In the photo, Fred's eyes sparkled with happiness, while Felix and Luna, still eating, looked relaxed and at ease next to their new friend. After breakfast, Clara put on some Christmas music, filling the house with a soft and cheerful melody. Fred, excited, began spinning in circles in the middle of the room, as if dancing. Luna, enchanted, started chasing him, meowing playfully. Felix, more reserved, climbed onto the Christmas tree and knocked one of the shiny ornaments to the floor, as if to say, "You forgot about this." When Clara sat down to watch, holding a cup of hot chocolate in her hands, she realized how much her life had changed since Fred appeared at her door. Felix and Luna, once inseparable, now had a new companion. And Fred, who had arrived as an injured and lonely dog, was now an essential part of the family. The fireplace crackled softly, and the Christmas tree glowed with colorful lights. Clara smiled as she saw the three of them lying together near the warmth of the fire, something she never thought would happen. Felix was in the middle, with Fred on one side and Luna on the other. Despite their differences, they had found a way to coexist, and more than that, to love one another. Clara picked up her journal and wrote a sentence that seemed to sum it all up. The true Christmas miracle isn't in presents or decorations, but in opening your heart to love, even when it comes from the most unexpected places. She looked at the three of them and, for the first time in a long while, felt she wasn't alone. Fred had found a home, Felix and Luna had found a brother, and Clara had found proof that, when love is true, it always finds a way. At that moment, under the twinkling lights of the Christmas tree, they were a complete family. A family born from the unexpected, but now destined to stay together forever. Clara looked at her three companions and felt her heart overflow. Christmas wasn't just about presents or decorations, but about acceptance, unity, and unconditional love. Fred had found a home, and Felix and Luna had found a brother they never knew they needed. That night was proof that, even in differences, love always finds a way to transform everything. If even cats and dogs can learn to love, what's stopping us from doing the same? And so, under the lights of the Christmas tree, that unusual family became whole.